Biopics have, for the most part, been a polarizing topic under the lens of audiences' judgments. Oftentimes, people get defensive due to either having lived through the time period in question or personal perspective of how things actually happened, since obviously there's always at least two sides to every story. And for the most part, I think that making biopics is the equivalent of swimming against the current because of the nature of movie making always clashing with historical and emotional accuracy. That being said, I find enjoyment in biopics because not only does it give me insight into some things that I may not have known about the person, but it also gives me a new perspective on how things might have happened. I do enjoy films like A Beautiful Mind, The Social Network, and Oppenheimer, and it would be disingenuous of me to say that I wasn't at least a little excited for the long-awaited biopic starring Timothee Chalamet, A Complete Unknown. After multiple delays, the film is released, and if your subject is Bob Dylan, obviously it's going to be a musical biopic, which isn't guaranteed to fall into the good graces of audiences. But at the same time, it's about Bob Dylan, who, while I'm not a Midwestern boy, I've always loved his music, and his story has always been so intriguing and unique to me. Hell, I even have him on vinyl that I listen to every now and then on my record player. Also, it very much helps that it stars Timothee Chalamet, who I've liked pretty much all of his performances, whether it's from being Paul in Dune, to being Laurie in Greta Gerwig's Little Woman, or Lee in Bones and All. Personally, I'm just not a fan of his role in Wonka, but something about that film in general didn't click with me, so it's not really on him, but outside of that, he's always been a pleasure to watch. And the guy is clearly selective with his roles, he understands what works for him, and he's quickly showing that he's one of the few actors that engross themselves entirely into their roles. One of my gripes with some biopics is that some actors tend to feel like they're putting on a costume of the person they're trying to be and hoping that an over-the-top performance is gonna help with the disguise. And one of the odd things about Timmy is that because of how memorable his look is, when you watch a trailer of a movie that he's gonna be in, it often can feel like, oh yeah, it's just him in a different wardrobe. But often is the case that once you watch the movie, you fully buy the character that he's trying to be. And that goes down to his study of the subject matter, as well as his adaptability to the small nuances that identify the character he's trying to be. It's delicate, but I often find that actors struggle to play a character versus a caricature, and often is the case where actors fall in the latter half. All this to say, it was no surprise that he was phenomenal. He performed at the peak of his powers, and I kinda really liked this film. A Complete Unknown is basically the story of how the legendary musician Bob Dylan got his start, his relationship with various people, and most importantly, his struggle with fame. For a film to have plot, it kinda needs to have a problem, or else why are you watching it, you know? And when comparing this to something like Bohemian Rhapsody or Elvis, the scale of the problem of the film seems much smaller than the aforementioned examples, but a story can be less grand and still be captivating and compelling. Generally speaking, the film is much slower paced, to the point that there is a bar fight that's there just to add like a quick jolt. But if you have enough of a charming protagonist, having a slower pace is not a bad thing by any means. And because Timothée Chalamet is the lead, all the narrative weight falls on him to make this work. If you really think about it, he's not been in too many roles where he didn't have the backing of huge production or a stacked cast to bounce off of. And that's not a criticism to him. If anything, this film proves he can carry a story really all on his own and still make the movie interesting. And don't get me wrong, the cast here was so strong. Edward Norton shows his experience by completely vanishing into the warm role of Pete Segar. Boyd Holbrook as Johnny Cash was electric and funny as hell, and Monica Barbero to me was probably right up there with Timmy in terms of quality performance. She was an absolute standout, and to be candid, I didn't know much about Joan Baez before having watched the film, but she was almost as nuanced and complex as Bob Dylan himself. I'd argue her role was among the hardest to play because in a way most of the other characters felt like any and all actions they took were dependent on Bob Dylan, while it was almost the opposite with Joan, as it almost felt like Bob was hovering in her orbit instead, and they interacted more out of convenience rather than her gravitating towards him. They just have so much chemistry anytime they were on stage, and I just couldn't get enough of it. The film is a beat-by-beat summary from a playbook of his life, which is very typical in modern biopics, but I think the film uses it to its advantage. The difference here is that Bob Dylan is kind of an anomaly, something that doesn't exactly fit the mold of the shoe of what it is to be a superstar. I mean, the fact that most biopics end in some huge tragedy or some massive life event, while this movie kind of just ends abruptly like another day in the life of Bob Dylan, it tells you that this is different from others of its kind. The film is formulaic, but Bob Dylan is everything but formulaic. He's dissonant with the rest of society, like an outlier, but that's also what makes him appealing and magnetic. Bob Dylan is a contrarian by nature before it became a fad to be so. He's enigmatic and impulsive, but he's functioned solely off of what he wants to do, regardless of external factors and pressures, and there's a lot of merit to not wavering to something so trivial as social norms and expectations. But he also proves how much effort he puts into what he wants. I absolutely love the line when he tells Sylvie they're not asking where the songs come from anymore, they're asking why the songs didn't come to them. He's mature enough to understand that in order for him to continue to be successful, he has to keep evolving in a way that only he can. And it's fun to see how much of a priority it is for him to write songs. He writes like he's running out of time. And it's comically silly that people loved him for being a symbol of change and being an icon that can understand the change, but the moment he himself goes through a change, everybody just jumps ship and couldn't understand that. I love how Dylan sticks out like a sore thumb among other extremely talented people as well. He quite literally is the physical manifestation of change, and it's why the love and criticism that he received throughout the film works so well. The turbulent nature of change is prime for polarizing opinions. One of the major plot points of the film and of his story is that at a certain point he decides to go electric, and that didn't sit well with people. And while the film depicts this through reactionary storytelling, it also doesn't try and dig any deeper into this aspect of his career. Yes, it's shallow storytelling, but the film isn't trying to solve a puzzle or a mystery as to why he did what he did, and certainly showing you as many important moments of his career as possible doesn't answer anything either. It relies on you understanding what he represents and the magnitude of what he means to society. Ultimately, films like Oppenheimer and Bohemian Rhapsody work because larger themes such as psychological influence transcend the story being told to you of events that happened. Like I said before, Bob Dylan's story doesn't have much of those bigger problems that can be explored in this film, so in a way it feels like Mangold chose the most reliable path to make this film. Also, I appreciate that the film was shot beautifully. It also felt like we were in the 60s, with the apartments and hotel rooms looking so alien to what we're used to now. And the film's depiction of events that happened felt so real it gave me chills. Personally, I love the inclusion of the Cuban Missile Crisis and how it influenced who Bob Dylan is. I like how the film showed the fear of the people through multiple perspectives, the chaos that they must have experienced, because yeah, at this point they probably did feel like it was going to be the end of the world. And the criticism of historical inaccuracy of certain events being altered for more dramatic effect is definitely not something new. Most, if not all, biopics alter information so they could have more suspense and tension, and especially under these circumstances where there wasn't nearly as much heavy subject matter to lean on as other biopics had, it's inevitable that people are going to be more pedantic about how certain things were altered to have the film feel like a complete story. Personally, I'd say my only con with the film is that at the beginning of the third act, it did feel a bit self-indulgent because there kind of wasn't enough plot, so they kind of inserted a compilation of great songs, which was cool, but for the movie itself, it did feel too long, especially since the runtime is already 140 minutes. Ultimately, I'm of the opinion that the film succeeds at highlighting how fascinating and complex a person Bob Dylan is. It's definitely not for everyone because of the slower pace, but as a fan of Dylan, I'm extremely happy I now have this biopic to look back on anytime I want to see that little brown hat. But that's it for me. I'd appreciate a thumbs up, subscribe, and sincerely yours, Anthony.